The night it all ended didn't begin with shouting. It began with the sound of a knife scraping against a plate, and my father asking if someone could pass the salt. The air was heavy, the kind of stillness that makes even small sounds feel too loud. I remember staring at the flickering candle in the center of the table, its flame bending every time someone breathed too hard. My mother had cooked her usual Sunday roast, the one she made when she wanted things to look normal. My brother sat beside her, talking about his wedding plans like the world revolved around him. I listened quietly, nodding when someone looked my way. I had just finished college, working small jobs to stay afloat, waiting for something in my life to finally start making sense. My parents didn't see that as progress. To them, I was just stuck. When my father started talking about how space was going to be tight once my brother got married, I didn't think much of it. I kept cutting my food, pretending not to notice the way he glanced at me. Then he said it, clear and sharp as a blade. "You'll need to give up your room," he said, not looking up. "Your brother and his wife will move in here. You can stay until the wedding's over, or you can make other arrangements." For a second, I thought he was joking. I waited for my mother to laugh, to say something like, "Don't be ridiculous," but she didn't. She just looked down at her plate, her fork tracing the edge of her food like she couldn't bear to meet my eyes. My brother smiled faintly, as if he'd been expecting it. My chest tightened. I asked softly, "You want me to move out? For him?" My father didn't even flinch. "He's starting a family," he said. "It's time you learned to stand on your own." I wanted to remind him of everything I'd done, how I helped pay bills when he was laid off, how I took care of Mom when she was sick, how I gave up job offers just to stay close because they needed me. But the words never came out. They didn't deserve them. The silence stretched until it felt like it was strangling me. I pushed my chair back slowly, the legs scraping against the floor like a scream I couldn't let out. No one stopped me when I stood, not even my mother. That was the moment I knew something inside me had changed forever. I walked out of that dining room with my heart pounding and my mind clear for the first time in years. They thought they were throwing me out. What they didn't know was they'd just set me free. Morning came too soon. I woke to the sound of birds outside my window, the same ones I used to listen to when I couldn't sleep as a kid. Their song felt different now, hollow, distant, like even they were telling me it was time to go. The air in my room was cold, still heavy from last night's words. I sat there for a while, just staring at the walls that had seen every version of me. The little girl who painted stars on the ceiling, the teenager who cried through exams, the woman who kept forgiving people who didn't deserve it. I started packing quietly. Each drawer I emptied felt like I was erasing evidence that I had ever existed there. My mother moved through the hallway, footsteps light, like she didn't want to be caught in the same space as me. When she finally appeared in the doorway, she didn't speak. Her hands were folded tightly in front of her, her eyes fixed somewhere over my shoulder. I wanted her to say something, anything, but all she gave me was silence. My brother walked past with a grin that barely hid his satisfaction. He tossed a casual, "Need help?" over his shoulder, knowing I'd say no. It wasn't an offer. It was a reminder that he'd won. I kept folding clothes, one after another, my movements steady, mechanical. Every shirt felt heavier than it should have, soaked with years of doing too much for people who gave back so little. Downstairs, my father was already gone for work. He didn't even wait to see me leave. Typical. I carried boxes out to my car, stacking them in the back seat, the trunk, wherever there was space. My mother stood by the front door, her arms wrapped around herself. When I finally closed the trunk, she whispered, "You'll understand when you have a family of your own." That sentence sliced through me. I wanted to laugh, to ask her what kind of family teaches love by cruelty. Instead, I nodded, just to end the moment. The truth was, I did understand. I understood that family wasn't always love. Sometimes it was ownership disguised as care. I got into the car and started the engine. The house looked smaller from behind the windshield, the curtains drawn like eyes refusing to meet mine. As I drove away, I watched it shrink in the mirror until it became nothing but a blur against the morning light. The farther I went, the lighter I felt. But somewhere beneath that freedom, anger was still building, quiet and patient, waiting for its turn to speak. The apartment was small, tucked beneath a crumbling brick building that smelled faintly of damp concrete and old paint. When I first unlocked the door, the silence felt heavy, almost physical. It wrapped around me like a blanket I didn't ask for. There were no voices, no footsteps above my room, no clinking dishes, no faint hum of family arguments echoing down the hallway. Just stillness. I thought I wanted peace, but peace has a way of making you hear things you've been trying to forget. I bought a secondhand mattress and a wobbly table from a thrift store, told myself it was temporary. The walls were thin, painted the color of dust, but they were mine. I worked long shifts at a diner across town, serving coffee and counting tips in the back room, trying not to think about the people I'd left behind. Every night, I came home with sore feet and tired eyes, dropped my apron by the door, and sat in the quiet. Sometimes I'd talk just to hear a voice, even if it was only my own. One evening, scrolling through my phone, I saw the photos. My family all gathered around the dining table I'd grown up at. My brother in his wedding suit, my parents beaming, the same walls behind them that used to echo with my laughter. My mother's caption read, "Family is everything." My throat tightened. I stared at that picture until the screen dimmed. That house, the one that pushed me out, had become their stage again. It wasn't grief I felt. It was clarity, the kind that burns away every illusion of love. That night, I opened a notebook I'd kept since college and began to write. Not poetry, not reflection, just facts, dates, words, betrayals, the small cruelties they called lessons. I didn't write to forgive or to move on. I wrote to remember, to never let myself rewrite history in their favor again. Page after page, I built my own kind of truth, one they couldn't twist or erase. Some nights, I'd close the notebook and sit in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint drip from a leaky pipe. The quiet no longer scared me. It started to feel like armor, like a space where I could finally think without their voices filling my head. For the first time in my life, the silence didn't mean I was alone. It meant I was free. And freedom, I was learning, could sound a lot like revenge. It started with a letter I almost threw away. A thick white envelope, buried under bills and diner coupons, stamped with my name in bold black ink. At first, I thought it was junk mail, but when I tore it open, my hands began to shake. It wasn't a promotion or a credit offer. It was a notice, past due, final warning. The numbers didn't make sense. The loan amount was huge, something I'd never applied for. My name was on every page, signed neatly in handwriting that wasn't mine. I sat on the floor, staring at it, my pulse thudding in my ears. My credit was destroyed. My identity wasn't stolen by a stranger. It was stolen by my own blood. I called the bank, desperate for an error, a mistake, anything. But the voice on the other end was polite, firm. "The signatures match your family records," she said. "It appears your parents are co-signers." The room spun. I could almost hear my father's voice, calm and dismissive. "You'll understand when you have a family of your own." That night, I called my mother. She answered after the third ring, her tone too casual. When I asked about the loan, she went quiet. Then came the stammering, the excuses, the familiar dance of guilt and blame. "It was your father's idea," she said finally. "We just needed help at the time." Help. That word tasted like acid. I asked if she realized what they'd done to my future. She sighed, told me not to overreact. My father took the phone, his voice steady, patronizing. "It's family business," he said. "You'll be fine." Something inside me froze. Family business. That was the moment love turned into something colder, harder. I hung up without another word and stared at the wall until my reflection in the window looked like a stranger's. I'd always been the one who forgave, who kept peace, who cleaned the messes no one else wanted to face. But forgiveness had done nothing but make me easy to use. The next day, I bought a small recorder. I started saving every voicemail, every message, every word they said. Not for confrontation, for proof. Every text from my mother that began with, "Don't be dramatic." Every voicemail from my father that ended with, "We did what we had to." I kept them all. They thought silence meant surrender. They were wrong. I wasn't the same daughter who walked out of that house. I wasn't going to scream or beg. I was going to wait, watch. And when the time was right, I'd make sure every lie they told came back to collect its debt. The letter came folded in half, the kind of paper that feels heavier than it should. "Final notice," it said in red across the top. I read it 3 times, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something else. They didn't. The debt wasn't mine, but the law didn't care whose hands had signed the papers. My name was enough. I sat there for a long time, the paper trembling between my fingers, until anger gave way to something quieter. Resolve. That night, I drove back to the house I once called home. The porch light was still the same weak yellow glow, flickering against chipped paint. I hadn't been there in months, but every step up the walkway felt like walking through a memory that had gone sour. I didn't call ahead. I didn't knock softly. My father opened the door, his expression already annoyed, like I was late to a fight he thought he'd already won. I handed him the letter without a word. He unfolded it, glanced at it once, then gave a low laugh that made my skin crawl. "You owe the family that much," he said, as if it were obvious, as if betrayal could be justified by blood. My mother stood in the background, her arms crossed tightly, eyes fixed on the floor. She didn't speak. She never did when it mattered. I looked around the room, the same walls, the same furniture, everything preserved like a shrine to a family that only existed in photographs. The air smelled faintly of dinner, of normalcy they didn't deserve. I asked my father if he even understood what he'd done. He shrugged. "You'll survive." "You always do." The words were meant to sting, but they didn't. Not anymore. Something inside me shifted then, not from rage, but from clarity. I realized there was no love to save here, no apology worth waiting for. I told him calmly that I'd handle it. My tone was steady, detached, and for the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker in his eyes. When I turned to leave, I glanced once at the dinner table behind him, the same table where it all began. Only now it looked different, colder, emptier, like a crime scene. The place where love had been murdered, and the killers were still sitting there pretending nothing ever happened. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and the letter still open beside me. The anger had cooled into something sharper. Focus. I started searching online, one tab after another, trying to understand what I could do. Every article said the same thing. If my name was tied to the loan, I had the right to request a full financial audit. It sounded simple on paper, but I knew better. My family wouldn't just let me uncover what they'd buried. They'd lie, twist, destroy whatever they had to. I'd have to move quietly. The process began with calls to banks, departments, endless forms that made my head ache. I learned to keep my tone soft, polite, almost detached. The voice of someone who wasn't planning anything dangerous. Meanwhile, I started sending my parents short messages again. Little check-ins. How's Mom's garden? Did the business finally sell? They replied warmly at first, relieved maybe, thinking I'd given up. That was good. Let them think that. My brother reached out next, all charm and convenience. He wanted help setting up his new business account, said he trusted my organization skills. I agreed, smiling through every call, taking notes he didn't know I was keeping. Each conversation became another thread in a web I was slowly spinning around them. Every screenshot, every message I stored carefully. Revenge didn't need noise. It needed patience. At night, I'd sit in the dark and imagine the day everything would come undone. The same table where they once told me to give up my room, I pictured it again, but this time I'd be the one with the papers, the proof, the truth. They'd see the version of me they created, the one they thought was too soft to fight back. Days turned into weeks, and the audit request was finally moving forward. I kept smiling in texts, kept my tone sweet on calls, even laughed when my father said, "I'm proud you're learning responsibility." I didn't correct him. I just said, "You taught me well," because he had, in his own cruel way. He taught me that silence was power when used right, and when the time came, that silence would be the sound of everything they built collapsing around them. The audit began on a Tuesday morning, quiet and unassuming, like most things that end up changing everything. I received an email from the investigator assigned to my case. Polite, brief, almost detached. They were beginning the verification process. I reread it 3 times before closing my laptop and staring at the blank wall across from me. My hands felt steady, but inside, something trembled. Not fear, not guilt, but the strange hum of inevitability. Weeks of silence followed. Every few days, I'd get updates. Most were routine, numbers and statements, the kind of language meant to sound neutral. But one afternoon, the tone shifted. The investigator's voice over the phone carried something new. Caution. "We've found some inconsistencies," he said, "signatures that don't align." He paused, then added, "We'll need to escalate this." I didn't ask what that meant. I already knew. By the end of the week, the report arrived. I opened the file, scrolling through page after page until I saw the signatures. Mine, my mother's, my father's, even my brother's, repeated across documents I'd never seen before. My name used like a key to unlock debt and deceit. Seeing it all there, in black and white, didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing at the edge of something vast and broken, realizing the people you trusted had built the cracks with their own hands. That night, my phone started ringing. First my mother, then my father, then both together. I didn't answer. The messages poured in, pleading, desperate, angry. My father's voice on the last one was hoarse, uneven. "We didn't mean for it to go this far," he said. "Please, just drop it." I stared at the screen until it went dark. They weren't sorry for what they'd done. They were sorry they'd been caught. When the official notice was delivered to their house, I imagined them sitting at that same dinner table where it all began. My mother clutching the letter, my father pacing, my brother silent for once. Maybe they'd finally feel what I felt that night, powerless, unwanted, disposable. The irony almost made me laugh. I didn't celebrate. I didn't tell anyone. I just sat in my apartment, listening to the faint buzz of the city outside, feeling both vindicated and empty. Justice wasn't loud. It didn't scream or demand applause. It just arrived, quiet and steady, like a meal being served cold, the kind my family had prepared for me long ago. The news came in fragments, An email from the investigator, a headline in the local financial bulletin, a whisper from someone who still lived on their street. The investigation had frozen their accounts. Their house, the one that had stood like a monument to pride and reputation, was now under review as collateral. It didn't happen overnight. It crumbled slowly, the way old walls give way to rot. And for the first time, the silence that followed wasn't mine. It was theirs. I heard from a neighbor who used to gossip with my mother. She said people were talking, that my father had stopped showing up at the country club, that my mother barely came outside anymore. My brother's business partners had pulled out. Too risky, they said. Everything that once made them untouchable was slipping through their fingers, one signature at a time. When I walked past their street a few days later, the place looked smaller than I remembered. The garden my mother had prided herself on was unkept, weeds curling around the porch steps. Curtains that were always perfectly drawn now hung uneven. I stood across the road for a long time, staring at the windows that had once glowed warm each evening. My room, the one they'd taken from me, was dark. I could see the outline of bare walls, stripped of everything that used to make it mine. It looked hollow, like the rest of them. A strange calm settled over me. It wasn't joy or triumph, just stillness. Revenge didn't feel like victory. It felt like quiet balance, like the universe had finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. I thought about that night at the dinner table, about my father's words, my mother's silence. They had built their comfort on my compliance, and now that I had stopped playing along, the foundation cracked. For a moment, pity stirred in me, a faint ache for what might have been, for the version of them that could have chosen love instead of control. But it passed quickly, fading like fog under a streetlight. They weren't victims. They were architects of their own collapse. As I turned to leave, a gust of cold air swept across the street. I looked back once more and saw frost beginning to form on the windows. It crept slowly across the glass, delicate and merciless, a final layer of truth sealing everything they'd tried to hide. Justice, I realized, doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it arrives like winter, quiet, inevitable, and cold enough to make the proudest house fall. The call came just after midnight. I almost didn't answer. The number flashed across my phone, unfamiliar but hauntingly close, the same area code I'd spent half my life trying to escape. I let it ring twice before picking up. My mother's voice was trembling, wet with tears. She didn't say hello, just whispered, "Your father's in the hospital." For a moment I couldn't find words. Then came the rest. It's his heart, the stress. Everything's falling apart. I sat there in the dark, the phone pressed to my ear, my body frozen. Part of me wanted to hang up. Another part, the one that still remembered the man who once lifted me onto his shoulders as a child, couldn't. I told her I'd come in the morning. She cried harder, but I ended the call before I could change my mind. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and loss. The lights buzzed faintly, the kind that make every face look pale and tired. When I stepped into his room, I almost didn't recognize him. The man lying in that bed wasn't the one who'd told me to leave, or the one who'd forged my name to his debts. He looked smaller, fragile, his chest rising unevenly beneath a thin blanket. My mother sat beside him, her hands twisting a tissue into ribbons. She looked up when she saw me, her face blotched with red. "He didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered. "He's sorry." I watched his face, still and quiet, and realized she was wrong. He wasn't sorry. He was simply broken by the same weight he'd once placed on me. My mother reached for my hand. "Please," she said softly, "forgive him." Forgiveness. That word again. It sounded like another demand, another debt I was expected to pay. I slipped my hand from hers, reached into my bag, and pulled out a small envelope. Inside were copies of the forged papers, the proof of everything they'd done, and a note in my handwriting. You taught me the cost of love. I placed it on the bedside table and turned to leave. My footsteps echoed through the sterile corridor, slow and hollow. Behind me, the machines kept beeping, steady and cold. It didn't sound like guilt or revenge. It sounded like closure. The call came on a quiet afternoon, sunlight spilling through the blinds like a memory that refused to fade. When my phone rang, I already knew what it was. Some part of me had been waiting for it, the way you wait for a storm you've seen building in the distance. My mother's voice was flat, not trembling this time, just empty. He's gone, she said. No preamble, no build-up. I waited for grief to come, but it didn't. It wasn't shock either. It was just silence, a kind of peace I didn't know how to name. A week later, I sat in a lawyer's office surrounded by polished wood and stale air. My brother was there too, checking his watch, already impatient. The lawyer looked uncomfortable, as if he'd been asked to deliver news he didn't believe in. He cleared his throat and began reading. My father's will, written hastily before his death, left everything, the house, the accounts, the land, to my brother. I didn't flinch. I'd expected it. My brother didn't look at me, but his smirk said enough. Then the lawyer paused. There's one more item, he said quietly. He reached into a folder and pulled out a small envelope. My name was written on it in my father's familiar, uneven handwriting, the kind that leaned slightly to the right, like it had been written in a rush. The lawyer slid it across the table as though it weighed more than it should. I didn't open it there. I just nodded, thanked him, and walked out. Back at my apartment, I sat on the floor with the envelope resting in my lap. The paper felt warm, like it had been waiting for me. When I finally tore it open, a single photograph slipped out. Me on his shoulders at the beach, maybe 5 years old, my small hands tangled in his hair. Behind it was a single page. His handwriting was weaker now, almost trembling. I made mistakes. Too many. I hope you build a life that doesn't look like mine. That was all. No apology. No explanation. Just the truth, stripped bare. I stared at that photograph for a long time, feeling something stir. Not love, not forgiveness, but grief for what could have been. For the version of him I used to believe in. The one who might have loved me before pride and control took over. When the feeling passed, I found an old shoebox in my closet, labeled it "Proof I Survived," and placed the photo inside. It didn't belong on the wall or in a frame. It belonged with the evidence of everything I'd endured and outlived. I closed the box gently, knowing that some goodbyes don't need words. They just need silence, the kind that feels like freedom. It took months to find the right place. I wasn't looking for anything grand, just something that felt untouched by my past, a blank space where no one's voice echoed but mine. The studio I found was small, with high ceilings and sunlight that poured through wide windows every morning. The first time I stepped inside, the air smelled of plaster and dust, and I smiled. It didn't matter that the walls were bare or that the floor creaked when I walked. It was mine. Every inch of it belonged to no one but me. I painted the walls a pale cream, hung soft lights, and stacked my books along the window ledge. Each shelf, each corner slowly began to hold pieces of my story, photographs from places I'd gone alone, paintings I'd made on restless nights, notes scribbled with thoughts that no longer hurt to read. It wasn't fancy, but it was alive. Sometimes I'd catch myself just standing there, breathing in the stillness, feeling how far I'd come from that dinner table where everything began to fall apart. When I wasn't working, I started recording. I'd always written about pain, but now I wanted to speak it aloud, not as confession, but as release. I bought a simple microphone, set it on my desk, and called the podcast At the Family Dinner. It wasn't meant to go viral. It was just my voice telling the story of that night, the moment my father told me to give up my room or leave, the moment I chose myself instead of their approval. I spoke slowly, letting every word settle like dust after a storm. I didn't mention names or details, only feelings. The silence that followed betrayal, the way anger hardens into clarity, and the strange peace that comes when you stop waiting for an apology. When I finished recording, I hesitated before uploading it. My finger hovered over the button, trembling slightly. Then I clicked publish. Days later, my inbox filled with messages. Strangers, women, men, even teenagers, wrote to say they understood. They spoke of their own family dinners, their own moments of being told they weren't enough, their own quiet exits from homes that didn't feel like home. Some messages were long, full of tears and gratitude. Others were just 2 words: thank you. Reading them, I realized my story had stopped being about revenge. It had become something else, proof that pain, when shared, can build connection instead of destruction. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the room filled with golden light, I listened to my own voice playing softly through the speakers. The words sounded distant, like they belonged to someone I used to be. I looked around at the room, the plants near the window, the books stacked neatly, the soft hum of the city outside, and felt a calm I couldn't explain. I whispered it quietly, not to the walls, but to myself. I chose this. And for the first time, the words didn't sound like defiance. They sounded like peace. Sometimes the room you're forced to leave becomes the space where you finally learn to live.